Welcome to Sacred Heart University's Center for Catholic Studies Speaker Series. The Center for Catholic Studies promotes innovative and cutting-edge programs that demonstrate Sacred Heart University's mission rooted in the Catholic intellectual tradition as a living reality related to our lives and in the world in which we live. Join us now live from the campus of Sacred Heart University with our host, Dr. Chelsea King.
Welcome to the Center for Catholic Studies Speaker Series. I'm Professor Chelsea King, and I will be your host this evening. Sacred Heart University Center for Catholic Studies presents innovative and cutting-edge programs that demonstrate Sacred Heart University's mission, rooted in the Catholic intellectual tradition as an ongoing, living conversation led by great thinkers in the Catholic tradition, speaking about important issues in our world today. Our series this spring features nationally and internationally renowned speakers who will focus on issues of social, racial, and environmental justice. For our program this evening, I am honored to present Dr. Catherine Mooney, who will be speaking on Changemakers, Catholic Women on Racial, Environmental, and Gender Justice. Dr. Mooney holds her bachelor's in history from St. Louis University, a master's in theological studies from Harvard Divinity School, an MA, master's of philosophy, and PhD in medieval history from Yale University. Her research and publications invite us to explore more carefully how women, especially saints, have been interpreted and portrayed throughout history. Her most recent book is Clara of Assisi and the 13th Century Church, Religious Woman, Rules, and Resistance. In this book, Dr. Mooney offers a new narrative of Clara of Assisi that shows how she successfully established a new form of women's religious life despite the opposition of some powerful ecclesiastics. And for those viewers who are interested, I'm told that an affordable paperback edition will be coming out this October. Dr. Mooney is currently president of the Hagiography Society, an international group of scholars who study the lives of the saints. Aside from her scholarly work, Dr. Mooney is involved in the human rights effort. She currently advocates on behalf of an indigenous group of people with whom she lived and worked in Latin America in the 1980s. And she circulates information about their situation to thousands of followers on Facebook. Dr. Mooney teaches graduate courses on saints, spirituality, the papacy, and the women doctors of the church at Boston College's School of Theology and Ministry. I have had the privilege of taking her courses while doing graduate work at Boston College, and it is now my great honor to be here introducing her talk to you all tonight. Dr. Mooney, I think I speak for everyone virtually present when I say that we are truly grateful and excited to have such an accomplished scholar and a person committed to lifting up the voices of women in the Catholic Church speak to us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor King, for that very kind introduction. It's very meaningful coming from someone whose work, both as a student and now a colleague, I've admired. It's an honor to be part of Sacred University's Center for Catholic Studies Speaker Series. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak to Sacred Heart students, and I want to welcome as well viewers from outside the university who are tuning in from other parts of the United States. Today, I want to talk about Catholic women who blaze trails for justice by standing up, speaking out, and taking actions on behalf of racial, environmental, and gender justice. I will introduce you to many women in this lecture, but the point is not for you to remember a laundry list of names and dates. Rather, I want to show you how movements for justice start small, often with single or just a few prophetic actors. Their messages are sometimes not heard for decades or even centuries, but through their persistence and actions, they contribute to the creation of large justice movements. This is something useful for us to keep in mind if we ever look out on our world in despair about some injustice, thinking, this will never change. It often seems that way, but situations only fail to change when no one does anything. Tonight, I want to introduce you to some Catholic women who stood up, spoke out, and took action. These three themes that I'm going to address are never fully separate. We know very well that what we now term intersectionality shows that there is no tackling one social justice issue while ignoring others, for they are all interrelated. So let me turn now to environmental justice. Understanding environmental justice in the Judeo-Christian tradition must first be grounded in Scripture. In Genesis, we read that after God had created everything, God looked upon it and saw that it was good. Creation is good. And throughout the Scriptures, in story after story, the point is driven home that God's desire for humanity and for creation is that life flourish. Yet, we look around us and see that often that is not the case. In fact, many scientists say we are at a tipping point, which leaves us little time to repair the damage that has been inflicted so that life can flourish. So many of us rightly turn to scientists to show us the way. But theology also matters. Indeed, it has sometimes been part of the problem in the past. For example, another verse in Genesis has often been misinterpreted. God commanded the man and woman in Genesis to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. For too long, this was read as an invitation to exploit and dominate nature, often for profit and gain. And this has harmed not only our planet, but the people on it. And the people most harmed by environmental degradation are the most vulnerable, the poor, the women, and people of color. So, talking even about the environment alone, we see how important intersectionality is. When we talk about issues of justice, it is impossible to remain with just one topic, such as women or race, for example, because one injustice always bleeds into and overlaps with others. Theology matters too, because for much of Christian history, the material world has been placed below the spiritual world as if it and care for it mattered less somehow. But this diminishes the importance of God's creation, which is good, and the fact that God created human beings as embodied beings. Even more, at the core of Christian belief is the incarnation, in which a fully divine God consciously chose to become fully human in Jesus Christ. 3 Catholic women in theology, and there are others, have appreciated this intimate connection between the divine and human worlds. I'll first reach into the distant past for an example, not only because that is where I locate much of my scholarship, but because it is important for us to know that we have had, for centuries, forebears on the front lines of this issue. Hildegard of Bingham was a 12th century German nun, visionary, theologian, prolific writer, musician, artist, scientist, healer, and preacher. Some of you may know her from her many music CDs, or because Pope Benedict XVI canonized her and then named her to be a doctor of the church in 2012. She was an innovator in many of these fields, light years ahead of her contemporaries. There was no environmental threat in Hildegard's day, yet her innovative views speak powerfully today. She centered her theology on the incarnation. Another key through thread uniting her many works is the concept of Veritas, a Latin term she used to denote the greening life force of God that vivifies all of creation. And by all of creation, Hildegard did not mean only women and men and other animals. She recognized God's greening grace within plants and even stones. You might think of Veritas as a sort of electricity or current running throughout everything that resides in the cosmos. Indeed, Hildegard dedicated a huge scientific medical tome to the healing properties of plants and stones. In manuscript illuminations, she illustrated the deep interconnections uniting the earth, water, stones, plants, animals, people, and the air they breathed. They were different yet interdependent features of God's single creation. Now, Hildegard was no Pollyanna. She was quick to also call out and denounce evil and injustice in the world. She believed when humans made wrong choices, it disrupted the harmony of creation. It set up an imbalance that inflicted suffering elsewhere in creation. Isn't this exactly what we are witnessing today in the extreme climactic events that have been spurred by the human contributions to global warming and that are bringing so much suffering to people in various parts around the world? Let me fast forward to a 20th century Catholic woman, Rosemary Radford Ruther. During the 1960s, next slide, during the 1960s civil rights movements, next slide, please. During the 1960s civil rights movement, Rosemary Radford Ruther was an activist in places like the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, where civil unrest had broken out after police arrested a young African-American man for drunkenness. Often referred to then as the Watts riots, today this would be simply one more episode within the Black Lives Matters movement. Ruther is known especially as a feminist. She has argued that the exclusion of women from leadership roles within universities, theology, and the church has propagated male-centered worldviews and systems of power. I raise these points in her biography to again signal how the categories I'm addressing in this talk overlap with each other. Living in a period when litter, air, and water pollution were beginning to garner some attention, she was one of the very first Catholics to tackle the entire subject of ecology head on. In 1975, she published a book of essays entitled New Woman, New Earth, Sexist Ideologies and Human Liberation. She wrote, "Women must see that there can be no liberation for them and no solution to the ecological crisis within a society whose fundamental model of relationships continues to be one of domination. The concept of the domination of nature has been based from the first on social domination between master and servant groups, starting with the basic relation between men and women. Intersectionality. Ruther draws a circle that explicitly links women's subordination and the planet's degradation. The woman in the 21st century I want to single out is Sister Elizabeth Johnson, who is now in the forefront of Catholic theologians writing about environmental justice. Her book, Ask the Beasts, Darwin and the God of Love, is based on a verse in the biblical book of Job. But ask the animals, and they will teach you. The birds of the air, and they will tell you. Ask the planets of the earth, and they will teach you, and the fish of sea will declare to you. Like Hildegard, Johnson recognizes God's presence in the world, an indwelling spirit that, like Hildegard's greening life force, is dynamically present within everything. Johnson's environmental concern regards not only the sufferings imposed on humans by self-serving overconsumption and pollution, but also the miseries humans are inflicting on the beasts, as she terms them. She reorients a theology that has centered first on humans, placing them in a dominant and exploitative position over the rest of the natural world, to focus on the earth. In so doing, Johnson rejects the model in which humans dominate the earth and advocates instead for a community of creation that acknowledges how all of creation interdependently forms a single community. Turning more now to gender justice, I want again to begin with scripture. Mary, the mother of Jesus, must be the best known woman of the New Testament. For many centuries, she has been depicted as a rather docile figure. When the angel announces, surprisingly, that she was to be the mother of Jesus, she answered, "I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be done unto me according to your will." Images of Mary often depict her in her role as Mother of Jesus. This is all appropriate, for Mary was willingly the mother of Jesus, but it misses other features of who Mary was. Next slide. Next slide, please. First, let me draw your attention. I'm sorry, one slide back. First, let me draw your attention to these rather traditional depictions of Mary. What do we see here? Mary and Jesus are red-haired or blondes. They are very white. Yet both Mary and Jesus were born in the Middle East. The color of their skin would have been a darker hue, and their hair also. In the United States, they would be considered people of color. Indeed, Jesus, as a young man, would probably have been stopped and questioned in airport security had he been traveling not long after 9/11. There are, I want to note, other depictions of Mary as Black, but these are not the images one typically sees in the United States or the Western world. We also do not typically see images of Mary as powerful, assertive, someone who speaks out for justice. Yet that is just what she does in her Magnificat, a song of praise in which Mary says, or sings perhaps, the following: "My soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for God has looked upon his servant's lowliness." Mary's lowliness. Okay, this highlights her humility. But it's not a false humility that masks fear, that cowers or grovels. True humility, it has been said, is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less. True humility shows itself when we think of others and their needs first. And when those needs are not met, standing up, speaking out, and taking action. And this is where Mary pivots in the rest of her Magnificat. She proclaims that God has shown might with his arm and dispersed the arrogant of mind and heart. God has thrown down the rulers from their thrones, but lifted up the lowly. God has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. This justice-seeking Mary is intrinsic to who she is. The artistic rendering you see of Mary in this slide is a variation on the Virgin of Guadalupe, painted by the Chicana artist Yolanda Lopez. Lopez captures the Mary who is both humble and brave. It is a self-portrait as well. Lopez sees herself in this defiant and joyous Mary. In contrast to the richly dressed Mary of much art, Lopez also sees her hardworking mother in Mary, thus linking Mary of Nazareth with simple women who labor in love. This is the Mary perfectly attuned to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, in which he both affirms those who help the poor, the hungry, the weeping, even while at the same time he issues harsh warnings to the rich, the well-fed, and those who enjoy life now with little attention to those in need. Among the groups which have been oppressed in history, women figure prominently. Even among the wealthy, there has been consistently a hierarchy that places men over women. Men in the public spheres of politics, business, church leadership, and other roles. Women cordoned off to the more private and helping spheres of human action, be it in the home or involved in service-oriented work such as teaching and nursing. This is noble work, but why should there be barriers or glass ceilings for women working in other spheres? Fortunately, this is all changing, but we still have so far to go. Sexism is not a specifically Christian issue. It predates Christianity, but it is an oppression that we see woven throughout Christian history and theology. Mary Magdalene and two other women were the first to discover Jesus' empty tomb. An angel sent them to announce the resurrection to the apostles. But 11 of the 12 apostles, not Peter, thought the women were talking nonsense and refused to believe them. This cartoon, although tongue-in-cheek, captures a painful reality of women in the Catholic Church. The apostles tell the three women, "So, ladies, thanks for being the first to witness and report the resurrection, and we'll take it from here." Why, we must ask, do women have so little voice in the church? Why is so little space given to them for leadership roles? Even centuries past, many Catholic women could name this injustice. In Hildegard's 12th century, continuing up until quite recently, the fall of humanity recounted in Genesis was blamed more on Eve than on Adam. Eve, the story went, willingly took the fruit and then seductively enticed Adam to take a bite as well. But in contrast to the theologians of her time, Hildegard placed the blame squarely on the devil. Hildegard was no feminist in any contemporary sense, but on this point, she was a much better interpreter of scripture than centuries of theologians after her. In the 16th century, the saint and doctor of the church, Teresa of Avila, was a prolific writer. She launched a new religious order and authored books on prayer, about her struggles to found some 19 religious communities, replete with comments about her conflicts with town officials and some clerics who opposed her. And she also wrote some satirical texts that poked fun at clerics. Teresa's writings were censored. She had one passage quashed in which she had complained about men's intimidation of women and their prohibition preventing women from doing and saying in public things that she believed were worth doing and truths she believed were worth speaking. Now, when an Orthodox, cloistered, 16th century nun makes complaints like that, you know the situation is dire. But let's move closer to our own times. The Second Vatican Council in the 1960s was a watershed moment in the Catholic Church. It signified an opening to the wider world that had not been there, and it advocated for greater collegiality, more inclusiveness within the church. But we are still searching today for what that might mean in the concrete. The Council, for example, which took so many momentous decisions affecting every Catholic in the world, gave virtually no space or voice at all to women. About 2,500 bishops attended the council, all with voice and vote. Many, many hundreds more male theologians and experts were also there and played influential roles. How many women do you think attended? Well, just 23 were invited, and they were invited to listen. They had no official role in the decision-making, no vote, although they were allowed to be on some of the subcommittees. Sister Mary Williams Sullivan, well known for her work in a Black neighborhood in Chicago, was invited to speak at a rally held by Martin Luther King in 1965. Noting linkages between the marginalization of Blacks and women religious, she asked the crowd, "Why are sisters like Blacks? Because they too are segregated, ghettoed, and because leadership is not encouraged in their ranks." And we must recall that religious sisters have had more voice in the church than lay women in general. Today, over 50 years after the Second Vatican Council, Pope Francis has stated his desire to appoint women to senior positions of leadership within the Vatican. And in just these past few days, putting his words into action, he has appointed a woman to be Undersecretary of the Synod of Bishops. The term undersecretary may not seem so exalted, but Sister Nathalie Beccar, who is just now finishing her advanced degree at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, where I teach, will have voting rights in the Synod of Bishops. There are bishops, by the way, who are contesting her right to have a vote, but it seems they will have to adjust. And as frontline pioneers in this movement, it is not surprising that many have had to fend off powerful opposition. For example, Hildegard, Teresa of Avila, Rosemary Ruther, and Sister Elizabeth Johnson have all had to contend with criticism leveled at them from the higher echelons of the Catholic world. But speaking up and standing fast, which is what they have done, is what makes change possible. Racial justice. Today, it's one of the most pressing concerns within the United States and within the wider Catholic Church. Of course, it should have been a greater concern centuries earlier, but we have the hope today of perhaps having arrived at a tipping point. While there have been sporadic cries for justice in the past, today there seems to be a constant chorus calling for change. But for change to happen, we must first honestly confront the past. I'll begin with scripture, as I have for my remarks on the environmental and gender justice issues. On the one hand, we can simply recall scripture verses such as Mary's call for justice in the Magnificat or in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Skin color does not emerge as a prominent biblical theme. Early Christians hailed from many regions, with people having many different skin hues. I'll focus my remarks on the Catholic Church in the United States, since this is where many of us find ourselves, and because racism is America's original sin. So, confronting our past. Western Europeans began immigrating in large groups to North America in the 16th century. Mostly Christian, many proved to be quite aggressive. You will have learned in school how Native American lands were stolen and how the southwestern section of the United States exists on conquered Mexican lands. In the time remaining, however, I want to talk particularly about African and African American people of color. Already, when Europeans began arriving, Africans were being enslaved in large numbers, and those early European immigrants brought enslaved Africans with them. Not long before this, enslaved people had been of many colors, but around the 16th century, it was Africans above all who were being exploited. What was the Catholic Church's attitude about all of this? The Church, along with most of society, had long accepted slavery as a natural institution. Enslaved people are mentioned frequently in the New Testament, including by Jesus. The early church counseled slave owners to be good to their slaves, even looking well upon freeing them, but there was no abolitionist movement. There were no denunciations about enslaving other human beings. Early Christians who were free were blind to this great moral evil. In later centuries, the church had rules about people who could not be enslaved, but it also had rules outlining who could be justifiably enslaved. This included certain people taken in war, for example, or people who sold themselves or their children into slavery because they were poor and needed the money. It is not an uplifting history, and I won't try to sugarcoat it. It would not be until the 19th century, and this only after the US Civil War had ended and slavery had been outlawed in many countries, that popes began to harshly condemn the institution of slavery. On the US frontier, Black Africans and their African American descendants were enslaved in great numbers in the South, but also in the North. Men's and women's religious orders bought and sold enslaved people and had them work on their lands and in their houses. Finally, one more sad note. When the abolitionist movement began and gained steam in the United States, Catholics were slower than Protestants to take up this call for justice. We need to face history. As Maya Angelou has said, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. And in these awful circumstances, there are always pioneers who risk themselves and fight for justice. Henriette DeLille was just such a Catholic pioneer. The descendant of an enslaved African woman, DeLille herself was born in 1812 as a free, mixed-race woman and lived in New Orleans. She was expected, like many women of color in the period, however light-skinned, to enter into a type of concubinage that was common at the time. The practice was known as plaçage and involved enslaved or free women of color entering into extra-legal relationships with white men. Although freely embraced by many women, and I use air quotes for freely, I think we can all acknowledge that the power dynamics at play in these relationships diminished the meaning of free. The women reaped material benefits, but often enough, once the white men became financially established, they would leave the women of color and go on to legally marry white women. Some men kept the women of color on as mistresses on the side. Henriette DeLille refused to participate in this abusive practice, a practice condemned by the church and which DeLille recognized and denounced as abusive. She opted instead for a life of service. Catholic women's religious orders, which were white, refused entrance to women of color. One order for Black women had been founded in Baltimore in 1828, but there were no orders or religious associations for Catholic women of color in the South. DeLille, with two other women of color, changed that when she founded a group of laywomen, some married, some single, who banded together to perform works of charity for the needy and people of color. In 1841, DeLille established the first Catholic nursing home in the United States. Her group would eventually evolve into only the second religious order for Black women, the Sisters of the Holy Family. Founding a religious order of women perhaps does not seem to be such a radical strike for racial justice, but in DeLille's time, I think it really does constitute something like that. People of color at her time were subjected to very harsh discriminations, and she was a radical with all of the moves she made. She and other women of color extracted themselves from a system that would have them be the concubines of white men. They banded together to form their own charitable association at a time when white religious associations would not accept them. And they extended their service to many people of color. For example, they educated enslaved children, even though this was against Louisiana law at the time. DeLille also showed her brave audacity by refusing to pass as white, something some of her light-skinned relatives did. She embraced her identity as a woman of color. DeLille died in 1862, shortly after the outbreak of the U.S. Civil War. She is now a candidate for canonization in the Catholic Church. The Rollins Sisters were among the most influential Black women in the 19th century, and they struggled for racial justice in their hometown of Charleston, South Carolina. Raised Catholic, they attended a parish that segregated Blacks from whites by seeding, but was unusual nonetheless because it embraced all races. Their savvy father used his social skills to forge alliances with the white parishioners. He thus set an example for his daughters about how to be effective activists. Just after the Civil War, his oldest daughters, Katie and Lottie, founded and taught in a school for freed Blacks. Their school eventually foundered because, although the bishop had promised them funding for their initiative, he failed to follow through. Their sister Frances advanced the education of freed Black women and men by teaching in the government-sponsored Freedmen Bureau that assisted women and men freed in the aftermath of the Civil War. Frances was a formidable woman. For example, when she was denied first-class passage on a ferry boat because of her skin color, she sued the ferry's captain in a military court for violation of her civil rights, and she won that case. Later, attending Howard University School of Medicine, Frances became one of the first Black physicians in the country. The Rollins Sisters show us again that individuals finally attuned to one injustice see how it relates to other injustices. They founded the Rollins Salon as a place where interracial groups would gather to promote social causes related to race, women's rights, and other causes. Lottie was in the forefront of the suffragist movement, fighting for women's right to vote. She is just one of many examples of Black women who were leaders in this movement, but who, until recently, have largely been left out of a story that has given center stage to white women. In 1869, Lottie argued her case for the women's vote before the all-male South Carolina state legislature. She said, "We ask suffrage not as a favor, not as a privilege, but as a right based on the grounds that we are human beings and as such entitled to all human rights." Lottie and her 4 other sisters also organized an influential women's rights convention that was attended by both Blacks and whites. She was also elected secretary of the American Women's Suffrage Association, a coalition of Black women and men fighting for the vote for everyone, regardless of their race or gender. The Rollins sisters were movers and shakers in a deeply racist society. When the Ku Klux Klan began to gain ground in Charleston, Lottie, Frances, and another sister moved north, but their activism on behalf of justice continued. Frances, for example, became a clerk for the great abolitionist, writer, and statesman, Frederick Douglass. I turn finally to a 20th century Catholic woman whom everyone should know, Dorothy Day. Day is most known for founding the Catholic worker movement with Peter Moran in the depths of the US Depression. Day was a fighter for justice par excellence. When virtually no known Catholic prelates were speaking out on behalf of the working poor or Mexican immigrants, the unemployed, and the down and out, Day was. She wrote constantly about people who had been left out. She ruffled the feathers of many people, including prelates, who tried to dismiss her by calling her a radical, a moniker she proudly took as her own. Day was a journalist who could not be silenced, but she did more than simply write. She founded soup kitchens for the homeless when these were a rarity in the United States. Day did not flit in and out of these houses of hospitality, as they were called. She also lived there. She was a suffragist herself, and she went to jail about a dozen times in her life, many times for protesting justice issues that ranged from justice for farm workers to racial issues to arguing for peace in the midst of the Vietnam War. The Catholic Worker newspaper, which was widely distributed among the most destitute of society and which she founded, regularly featured religious imagery that made her point. Here, for example, is Christ in the breadline. She didn't make highfalutin theological arguments. She simply read the gospel and saw Christ in her fellow women and men, especially the poor, marginalized, and people of color. Day recognized, as she lived and traveled across the United States, that Black people were especially vulnerable to exploitation. Her frequent columns in the Catholic Worker newspaper regularly tell stories about racism. She presses her readers to consider why the church was not more involved in combating unequal treatment meted out to people of color. When Latinx farmers were striking for better wages and better treatment, Day, even as an old woman, was there with them. She made common cause with Martin Luther King. When he was assassinated in 1968, she wrote a poignant column decrying his death. She noted that from then on, she would always weep whenever she would hear the song, "We Shall Overcome," or when she read King's words, "Free at last, great God, free at last." When she was about 80 years old, not long before her death, Day was still protesting, this time on behalf of Latinx farm workers trying to get a just wage. You can see in her very demeanor that she would not be moved from her fight for justice. Fortunately, now in the 21st century, there's a strong movement in our country and in the church as well promoting racial justice. Black Catholic theologians such as Sean Copeland, Jamie Phelps, and Latinx theologians like Nancy Pineda Madrid are making their voices heard. They are inspiring a new generation to stand up. Let me conclude with 3 quick points. First, even while these movements on behalf of the environment, gender justice, and racial justice are clearly among us now and making progress, we have to keep in mind that progress is too slow. The injustices are still too great. It's important for us to keep and maintain an uneasy conscience about what we see. Second, we have to remember intersectionality, that one cause bleeds into another. We can't fight just for women, or just for people of color, or just for environmental justice. These are united issues. And one piece of advice, often we tend to fight for ourselves. So women are in the forefront of the fight for women's justice. People of color are naturally in the forefront of the fight for justice for people of color. But I think it's important for us all always to be involved in at least one issue for justice that is not centered on who we are. This is part of creating bridges among different groups. And finally, my third point is we have to act. Words are never enough. Love and justice show themselves in deeds more than words. Indeed, words without action are often simply empty. So with that, I'll close and turn it over to some question and answers, I hope.
Dr. Mooney, I thank you so much for this talk. It felt like the greatest hits. I'm so happy to say that in the courses that I teach here, the CIT seminars, we have students read some Hildegard, Dorothy Day. It's just wonderful to hear, a bit more detail about some of these women that I did not know about. So thank you for that. I want to invite people to ask their questions, pose their comments in the YouTube chat box. While we're waiting for that, I'm going to selfishly ask the first question, if I may. I love how you ended your talk on this sort of call to action. I was so struck by the images of Mary and how inaccurate those images are. And this is a question I pose to my students sometimes. I ask them, what should we practically do? What should the church do with these images that are sort of whitewashing, Mary, even Jesus? A sort of practical question. Should we change everything? Should we go into the churches and change all the, the artwork? Is that practical? Is that something we should do to kind of change our consciousness a little bit?
Well, I think a lot of those images should be changed. They are a misrepresentation of reality. It doesn't mean that we would do away with all the art that's been executed over the years, but maybe there's some analogy to be drawn, even with how we have been dealing with monuments to Confederate leaders. Some are being moved to museums and they are being appropriately labeled truthfully about what happened. They're not being left out there as icons, as if these people were heroes who were trying to maintain the institution of slavery. So I think we need many more correct portrayals. So we need to have, for instance, more statues and monuments to people of color who have been leaders, and remove the monuments to Confederate leaders to their proper place where there can be appropriate instruction. And the same thing with religious art. We have to have images, for instance, of Mary that show her assertiveness that we see in the Magnificat. We need to probably lose a lot of the blonde and very white images of Jesus and Mary, and even many of the saints.
Yes, and the redheaded Mary, I noticed that too. Just, get rid of that. I actually have a couple of questions coming in. They're tough questions, but I think you can handle them, Dr. Mooney. One question that we have from Grace says, do you think that church leadership recognizes the whitewashing that's gone on? Is there a recognition from church leadership that there is an issue?
About any particular issue, or about racism or women?
The way that Grace phrased it was the whitewashing. So we can interpret that in a way like.
Well, specifically regarding race, the bishops have put out different pastorals on racism. Many people who are up to speed on critical race theory have found these wanting. First of all, as a historian, but also just as a human being, I think we have to confront history honestly. We have to tell the story. We have to tell the story so we know what our starting point is. And then we need to take much more action, starting at the top, with acknowledging these injustices and trying to make things right. I think Pope Francis is making some moves in that direction. Some are very symbolic, like there's a huge monument to immigrants that now I think is in St. Peter's Square. I think one of his first visits was to an island where immigrants had been escaping and many dying in the Mediterranean trying to get there. But we need to do more. We need to ask ourselves, for instance, this is a societal issue, but also a Catholic issue. Why is it that most churches are still mostly white or mostly people of color? Of course, that's a neighborhood issue also. Why is it that there are not more people of color who are Catholics? I'm not sure that I can answer that entirely, but why is it that the church has not appealed to them more? So I think a great deal more needs to be done, and that we have a responsibility. If we're not in leadership roles, we have a responsibility to tell our leaders that we want this. It's not the old image of Catholic leadership and the flock, the sheep that follow. No, the church consists of all people, and we all have responsibilities. So if something is not being said that needs to be said, or something is not being done that needs to be done, well, we need to get up the gumption and speak truth to power.
Amen. So I have a question from a dear friend of mine, Fiona. She asks you, it's kind of a personal question, but I think it's an important question. How do you maintain your energy and joy for this work in mission? Oh, I guess it's on the screen here. What is your own spiritual practice for avoiding burnout and remaining compassionate?
Well, that's a good question. I have to admit that sometimes I have felt burned out. I think every human being does. So I wouldn't be untruthful about that. But I am optimistic. I do, believe in that statement that the arc of justice is that the arc of justice is long. Or I think I'm messing up the phrase, but the arc of history is long, or I forget what it is, but it bends toward justice. I am ultimately hopeful that right will win out. I think this is really intrinsic to faith. In the face of so much devastation, when you put on the news these days, there's there's one crisis after the others. There's one failure of leadership after the other. Same thing if you read the newspapers. If we just stuck with that, we would all lose hope. It's really only faith that lets us know that there are enough good people out there, enough pioneers that moves the ball forward. And as a historian, I would say this also, that sometimes I look back in history and there have been people like Francis of Assisi or Clare of Assisi fighting for justice in one way or the other, and it seems to be a losing battle. And some of these battles in their own lifetime are lost, and in the next generation as well, and in the generation after that. But it's really only because some people kept at it. They kept pushing the stone up the hill that they finally got that stone up the hill. So I really believe in the power of other people to make change. And then, simply put, we have to stay in touch with our friends, and we have to experience love, and we have to give love.
Absolutely. Okay, here's a really tough question. It's related to the changing times. Courtney asks, with the changing times, do you think women will be allowed to be priests? And to maybe a second question for you, Dr. Mooney, would be, what advice can you give people who might disagree with what the church teaching is, but also want to remain faithful to church teaching?
It's a good question. Do I think women will be priests? Well, the current teaching of the Catholic Church is very clear that women are not priests and will not be priests. So that's the teaching. Ordination to the priesthood is a disciplinary issue. It's not really core to the doctrine of the Catholic Church. It has, of course, historically been the practice not to have women as priests. But let me segue to another example before I return to this question. For centuries, for 19 centuries, the church accepted the institution of slavery. In 1866, the Holy Office, which is the predecessor of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith today, was still issuing a statement that gave certain just reasons for the enslavement of other people. 1866, that is after the end of the Civil War in the United States, and it's after slavery has been ended in most countries. That changed. A light bulb came on, and popes like Leo XIII and afterwards acknowledged that this had been an oversight, a terrible omission, a sinful omission. So I can see that things change, even when it looks like things won't change, because it's been all of history that way. It's been the tradition. So in terms of women's ordination, this is still a live dialogue. In the 1990s, I believe it was, Pope John Paul wanted all discussion to end, and he asked people to cease to speak about the issue. But of course, people kept talking about the issue. When Paul VI and other popes have talked to theologians and biblical scholars about this, the theologians and biblical scholars, faithful Catholics, differ on this. So I think that there is still room for discussion. The discussion won't stop. Will this happen in our lifetime? I'm not sure. I don't think it will happen under the papacy of Pope Francis, although he seems to be now entertaining the possibility of ordaining women as deacons. So what should Catholics do who find themselves at odds with the Catholic Church? Well, a very important teaching of the Catholic Church is you must do your best to form your conscience according to right and wrong, and your first obligation is to follow your conscience. So if your conscience tells you something, you need to stick to it. It doesn't mean you quit listening to other people, but you have to follow your conscience. And I would say you have an obligation to share your insights with other people, because maybe you will enlighten them, and maybe that will be a step toward change.
That's a fantastic answer, Dr. Mooney, to a very complex and complicated and controversial question. I actually just have one more final question for you, and hopefully it sort of sums up what your talk was really all about. There are plenty of examples of these amazing women in the Catholic Church who really, they spoke up, They really fought for justice, environmental, gender, and racial. Some amazing examples. I also really appreciated that your talk didn't shy away from the dark part of the Catholic Church and the dark parts of the Catholic Church. So my question for you is kind of pastoral. What would you say to women who no longer feel like the Catholic Church is their home?
Well, I would say some of the things I think I just said. You have to follow your conscience. Everybody has to find a home. It's regrettable when people are in a family of sorts, however large, and they no longer feel that they belong. We want those ties to hold. So I think it's always good to try and keep those ties strong, but everybody is called to flourish in life. As I said at the beginning of this talk, it's God's desire that life flourish and that every life flourishes. So people have to find situations in which they can thrive. But I would put in this one note, and that is, I think when we just get oppressed by a situation, we can fall into a situation of despair and want to escape. And I think one thing that can keep us motivated, and this also goes to the question of what keeps me motivated, is to fight. If you hit something that is worth a fight in your life, then it is going to energize you. So if you have some change that you think ought to be made in the Catholic Church, I would say get involved. Don't sit back and get depressed. Don't necessarily get sad and leave. Pick yourself up and do something about it. And I think you'll find it life-giving.
All right, Dr. Mooney, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. And I think I, again, speak for everybody when I say that we were truly, truly honored and privileged to have you here tonight. I think that'll do it. And I hope that everybody has a wonderful evening.
Well, thank you, and thank you all.
Thank you for joining tonight's program. To learn more, visit sacredheart.edu.